When I found the picture, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. A girl, maybe 15, smiling beside a birthday cake I'd never baked, standing next to a man I'd slept beside for 12 years. My husband, and written across the bottom in his handwriting to my little girl with all my love, Dad. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe he'd sponsored a child through one of those charities. Maybe it was from before we met, but the date on the back told another story. Last year, I remember sitting at the edge of our bed, the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the only sound in the room. The world outside kept moving, car horns, children laughing on the street, while mine stopped completely. I'd opened his laptop only because he'd asked me to print his travel documents. That's all. I didn't go looking for trouble. The folder was named Taxes Artsenling Arsersan, and inside, instead of spreadsheets and receipts, were photographs, notes, a school report card, a picture of her holding a trophy for speech and debate, and her last name, our last name. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. I remember whispering, "No, no, it can't be." Because if it was true, if what I was seeing was real, then the man who kissed me goodnight and poured my morning coffee had been living a double life right under our roof. I wanted to scream, to confront him right there. But all I could do was stare at the smiling girl, her eyes too familiar, her smile too close to his. That was the night everything in my home stopped feeling like mine. Before all of this, our life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Marcus and I had been married 12 years. We met in church. He sang in the choir. I worked with the children's ministry. He was charming in that quiet, dependable way. Not the type to make grand promises, but the type who kept the ones he made, or so I thought. We had no children. After years of trying and endless doctor visits, I learned it wasn't meant to be. Marcus was kind through it all, always saying, "We're enough, you and me." God knew what he was doing. I believed him. I needed to. Our house was small, but it felt full of laughter, of music, of Sunday dinners with his mother and brother. I ran a small home bakery, so the air always smelled like sugar and cinnamon. Marcus would tease me about how I sweetened the whole neighborhood. Looking back, I think the sweetness made it easier not to notice the cracks forming. Around the time I found that folder, Marcus had started staying late at work. He said his company was expanding their outreach, something about new clients and travel. I didn't question it. He'd always been hardworking, maybe too hardworking. When I'd ask if he was tired, he'd just smile and say, "I'm doing it for us, baby. For our future." And I believed him, because what else was there to believe? But there were small things, small enough that I brushed them aside. The phone calls he'd take in the car, his voice softer, almost careful. The extra shirts in the laundry that I didn't remember buying. The faint smell of baby powder on his collar, even though I didn't use any. No, I told myself it was nothing, that love meant trust. That doubt was poison, and I refused to be the kind of wife who lived suspicious. Until that folder proved I already was. That evening, when Marcus came home, he looked exactly as he always did, loosened tie, tired smile, the faint scent of rain on his jacket. I wanted to ask, I wanted to throw the picture in his face and demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I made dinner, roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, and listened as he talked about his day. My heart was screaming, "Who is she, Marcus? Who is she?" But my mouth stayed shut. When he kissed me goodnight, I turned my face slightly so he wouldn't see the tears collecting in my eyes. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the image of that girl. Her hair, the shape of her nose, the way she smiled, and then it hit me. I'd seen her before. At the grocery store near our house, a few times actually. She'd always nod politely when our eyes met, a sweet, shy smile. I'd even complimented her once on her braids. She couldn't have been more than 14 then. My stomach twisted. Had she been near us all along? The next morning, I woke early. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that almost hums. I made coffee, stared out the kitchen window, and thought about how fragile peace really is, how it can shatter with a single click on a folder. When Marcus walked in, I watched him pour his cup like nothing was wrong. And for the first time, I really looked at him. At the man I'd chosen. The man who apparently had chosen someone else too. I told myself I needed proof, not just guesses, not just a photograph. Proof that couldn't be explained away. So I started to pay attention, really pay attention, to the way his phone was always face down, to how he flinched when I asked about work trips, to how he avoided my eyes when I mentioned children. Every small lie started to build a larger truth, one I wasn't ready to face. But fate has a cruel way of helping us find what we're not ready for. Because just 3 days later, I saw her again, this time not at the grocery store. This time, she was standing on our street. She was waiting by the corner, backpack slung over one shoulder, staring down at her phone. I almost didn't recognize her at first, but when she turned, the resemblance to Marcus was undeniable. And then, like some cruel confirmation, I saw Marcus's car turn the corner. He slowed down beside her, rolled down the window, and she smiled, that same smile I'd seen in the photo. He looked both ways, then she got into the car, my husband. My husband picked up the girl from the folder. That was the moment the world I'd built cracked open completely. I stood frozen at the window, mug in hand as the car disappeared down the street. The smell of coffee turned sour in my throat. There are moments that divide a life into before and after. That was mine. I whispered to myself, who is she to you, Marcus? I ain't, but deep down, I already knew. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, not at first. When you've loved someone long enough, denial becomes a form of survival. I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe she was a friend's daughter. Maybe he was just giving her a ride home. Anything but what my heart already knew. That night, when Marcus returned, he was cheerful, too cheerful. He kissed my forehead, humming the same gospel tune he always did when he thought I wasn't listening. I asked casually, rough day? He smiled, long but productive. You know how the office can be. I nodded, pretending to listen while stirring a pot of soup that suddenly felt too heavy for my hands. He didn't mention the girl, not a word. After dinner, he took a shower, and I went to tidy up the living room. That's when I saw it, a faint smudge of pink glitter on the sleeve of his black coat, like the kind that rubs off from a school art project. It shouldn't have meant anything, but when trust has already cracked, even glitter feels like evidence. The next few days felt like living inside someone else's house. Marcus laughed the same way, touched me the same way, but everything between us felt hollow. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. He'd always kept his phone close, but now it never left his pocket, even when he went to the bathroom. He'd tilt the screen away when messages came in. Once, I caught a glimpse of a notification that said, "Tell her I miss you too." And when I asked who it was, he smiled gently, like he always did, and said, "Just a coworker, Sandra's daughter. She's like a niece to me." And I smiled back, because what else do you do when the truth is too painful to chase? But my body knew what my heart didn't want to admit. I stopped sleeping. I started checking his jacket pockets, his car glove compartment, even his work bag, something I'd never done before. And every time I came up empty, a part of me felt both relieved and ashamed. Then, one evening, I found a receipt from a cafe 2 blocks away from a local high school, 2 hot chocolates. 1 slice of strawberry cake. The date was the same day. He said he had a late client meeting. I went there the next morning. The cafe was small and cozy, with white walls and a chalkboard menu that smelled faintly of cinnamon and milk. I asked the barista, "Do you know a man named Marcus Johnson comes here often?" My tall man, always in a gray suit. Yeah, he comes in a few times a week. Sweet guy, usually sits with his daughter. Daughter, I felt the word hit me like a slap. I kept my voice steady. His daughter? Yeah, she said, smiling kindly. She's a lovely girl. Always brings her school books. They look just alike, no? I couldn't even thank her. My body moved on its own, out the door, down the street, into my car. The world around me blurred, cars honking, people laughing, all of it distant, unreal. My husband had a daughter. And I wasn't her mother. That night, I confronted him. He walked in from work like it was any other evening, whistling softly, his tie slightly loosened. Marcus, I said quietly, where were you today? He blinked, surprised. Work, same as always. Why? Io, which office? Io, he frowned. What kind of question is that? I didn't answer. I slid the cafe receipt across the table. The one near Lincoln High School? His jaw tightened, just slightly, but I saw it. Why are you going through my things? He asked. The shift in his tone, calm to cold, made my stomach twist, I said. I had to. Because I think you're lying to me, he exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. Baby, please. Don't start imagining things. You know how rumors get rumors? I interrupted, voice trembling. I saw you, Marcus. You picked her up from school. Oh. For a long moment, silence hung between us, heavy, suffocating. Then he whispered, so you know. I stared at him, waiting for him to deny it, but he didn't. He sat down, eyes downcast, and said, her name is Leela. The room seemed to tilt. How old? I asked. 14. I couldn't breathe. And she's yours? Io. He nodded once. I remember pressing my palm against my chest, as if I could hold my heart together physically. How long have you known about her? Since she was born, he said softly. It was before we got married. I didn't even know until years later. Her mother never told me. Not until she passed away last year. And then what? I whispered. You just started seeing her? She needed someone, he said, his voice shaking now. She didn't have anyone else. I didn't want to hide it, but I didn't know how to tell you. You've been through so much, and I thought maybe I could make it right quietly, like a secret affair, like a double life disguised as love. I looked at him, this man who had shared my prayers, my dreams, my mornings, and all I could see was a stranger. I would have understood, I said finally, voice breaking. I would have helped you, Marcus. But you lied. You let her live nearby, see you, call you Dad, while I thought we were a family of two. Tears streamed down his face, but they didn't move me, not yet. He whispered, I didn't want to lose you. But what he didn't understand was that by lying, he already had. That night, I packed a bag and went to my sister's house. I didn't tell anyone why, not yet. I just said I needed a few days to clear my head. When I lay down in her guest room, I couldn't stop replaying every memory, every smile, every word, every promise. Because when trust breaks, it doesn't shatter all at once. It crumbles slowly, piece by piece, until all that's left is dust. 2 days later, I got a message. It was from an unknown number, just one line. Whoa, that's wast Safarv. I think you're my dad's wife. No, and that's when I realized the girl, Lila, knew exactly who I was. Her message sat on my screen for a long time. I read it over and over, the way you touch a bruise just to make sure it still hurts. No, chures cure. I think you're my dad's wife. It was your hokinapranimashir polite. It was polite, careful. Like a child knocking on a door she wasn't sure she was allowed to open, I typed a reply, erased it. Terped again, erased again. Finally, I wrote, oh yes, I know, yes. I am. Seconds later, 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then came back. "Hey, I'm sorry," she wrote. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." My throat tightened. I could feel the tremor in my fingers as I typed back. "It's not your fault, sweetheart." "None of this is. We didn't talk about Marcus. Not yet. She asked if she could meet me. Said she'd understand if I didn't want to, and against every ounce of logic, I said yes. Because as angry as I was at my husband, I couldn't be angry at a child who never asked to be born into a secret. We met at the same cafe where I first learned she existed. Leela was sitting by the window, her backpack on the floor, fingers curled around a cup of cocoa. She looked so small, not in size, but in the way she carried herself. Like someone who'd learned to take up less space than she deserved. She stood when she saw me, Miss S. Johnson, Juvi Critcher predecessor that toughened to Johnson? Oh? I nodded. You can call me Claire. She smiled shyly. You look like the pictures. My heart skipped. Pictures? Yo, Kerr. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were several photographs, old ones, of Marcus and me, from our wedding, from vacations, from birthdays. He kept these in a box at his place, she said softly. Said you were the kindest person he'd ever known, UTDE Fess. Said you were the kindest person he'd ever known. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Because kindness felt like such a cruel word when you've been lied to, we talked for nearly 2 hours. She told me about her mother, a woman named Denise, who'd passed from cancer the previous year. She said Marcus had started visiting after finding out the truth, trying to help her settle into a better life. Hope your present worsher. I didn't mean to make him hide things, Leela said, eyes glistening. He just said you'd be mad if you found out. I swallowed the lump in my throat. He shouldn't have said that. You did nothing wrong, but inside my chest burned. Because every word she said painted a picture, not of a man who'd made a single mistake, but of one who'd built an entire second life out of fear. That night I drove home, not to my sister's home. Marcus was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of whiskey, staring at the wall like it might have the answers he couldn't find in me. He looked up when I walked in. Claire, Chomtley, Hupretians Tingbury Tissetetitions. Claire, I met her, I said quietly. He froze. Lila? I nodded. She reached out to me. He exhaled, long and heavy. I was going to tell you. I swear I was. When? I asked. After she graduated? Got married? When were you going to stop pretending you didn't have another child? He rubbed his temples. I was scared, okay? I didn't want to lose everything we built. But you already did, I said, voice trembling. The second you... I didn't deserve the truth. He stood then, stepping closer, his voice breaking. You don't understand. I didn't even know she existed until a year ago. I didn't mean to lie. I was just trying to protect both of you. By hiding a child? By meeting her in secret like she was something to be ashamed of? He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. You should have trusted me, Marcus. I would have helped. I would have loved her too. The sound. He knew I was right. Because deep down he knew I was right. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, touching everything we'd built together, the framed photos, the couch we'd picked out after our first big argument, the clock that ticked just a little too loud in the living room. And I realized that every memory had been rewritten. The laughter, the dinners, the quiet mornings, all of it existed alongside a lie. Around midnight, I opened his office door. I don't even know why. Maybe I was looking for closure. Maybe for proof that there was still something left worth saving. That's when I found it. A folder in his desk drawer, marked LJ. Inside were school reports, drawings, doctor's notes, and a lease agreement. My breath caught when I saw the address. It was for the small rental house behind our subdivision, the one I'd walked past dozens of times. The one where sometimes I'd seen a girl watering plants in the yard and thought she looked oddly familiar. Leela had been living there all this time, just a few minutes' walk from our home. I drove there the next morning before sunrise. The sky was still gray, and the world felt suspended in that quiet hour before everyone wakes. Leela was outside, sitting on the steps, hugging her knees. She must have known I'd come. I sat beside her without a word. We just sat there, two women connected by one man's lie. After a while, she said, "He told me not to tell you. Said he was waiting for the right time." I sighed. "There's never a right time for the wrong thing." She nodded, tears slipping down the wrong thing. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He's a good dad," she whispered, "but I hate that he hurt you." I felt something shift in me then. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding this girl had lost a mother. She didn't need to lose a father too. So I said softly, "None of this is your fault, Lila. Don't ever think it is." When I got home, Marcus was sitting on the porch, head in his hands. He looked up as I approached. "Where were you?" he asked. "With her," I said simply. He nodded, eyes red. "Is she okay?" "She will be," I said. "We both will. Eventually." Oh, he looked at me then, the kind of look that holds a question you don't dare ask aloud. And for the first time, I didn't have an answer. That evening, I packed another bag. This time, not out of anger, but clarity. I needed space to think, to breathe, to decide what forgiveness could look like, and whether I had it in me to give. As I closed the door behind me, I glanced once more at the family photo on the wall. Marcus' arm around me, both of us smiling, unaware that one day our truth would collapse under the weight of everything unspoken. I touched the frame gently and whispered, "You lied to protect us, but now we all need to heal, separately." Then I walked away, but 2 weeks later, a new envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside were 3 photos, one of Marcus, one of Lila, and one of them standing together in front of our house. On the back in Lila's handwriting were 4 words that made my heart stop. "You should know this." I stared at that photo until the edges blurred. Marcus and Lila, standing right in front of our porch, the same one I'd left behind 2 weeks earlier. He had his arm around her shoulder, smiling faintly. She looked peaceful. And yet, something about the image twisted in my gut. The words on the back, "You should know this," felt heavier than they should have. Was it a warning, a confession, or maybe, just maybe, a plea? That night, I called Marcus. He didn't answer. I called again, still nothing. Finally, I texted, "No, we need to talk." No reply. I sat at my sister's kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at the screen like it might suddenly light up with the truth. When it didn't, I drove back to the house, my house. It was past Joe PDM. But the porch light was still on. The door wasn't locked. He must have assumed I wouldn't come back. And inside, the living room looked untouched, the throw blanket folded neatly, my favorite mug on the side table. Everything looked normal, except for the silence. "Marcus?" I called out. No answer. Then I saw it. His briefcase open on the couch, papers scattered, one document lying half out. A school registration form. Leela Johnson, parent guardian, Marcus Johnson. My breath caught. He'd enrolled her in school under our address. When he finally walked in, I was sitting at the dining table with the papers spread in front of me. He froze, the color draining from his face. "Claire," he said slowly, "I can explain." "You then do," I said, my voice steady, in a way that surprised even me. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She needed stability. After her mother passed, she was lost. I wanted to bring her closer, give her a home, a chance to feel part of a family again. I know, and you thought the best way to do that, I said, was to hide her in our neighborhood? Enroll her in school under our name? Marcus, do you hear yourself? He stepped closer. I didn't want to overwhelm you. I was trying to handle it carefully. Carefully? I snapped. You built a life around lies, and you call that careful, Q? He looked broken then, shoulders slumped, eyes glassy. I thought if I told you you'd leave, he whispered, and I couldn't lose you, not after everything we've survived. I stared at him, my heart heavy but resolute. Marcus, I said softly, you didn't lose me because you had another child. You lost me because you didn't trust me enough to love her with you. That night, I didn't sleep again. Instead, I wrote pages and pages of thoughts I'd been carrying. Not letters, exactly. More like confessions about the anger I felt, the betrayal, the guilt for even feeling jealous of a child. And under it all, the fear that maybe I'd become someone I didn't recognize anymore. Someone who defined love by loyalty instead of honesty. By morning, I had one page left blank. For him. For whatever he might want to say back. When he came downstairs, I handed him the folder and said, if there's anything left of us worth saving, it starts with the truth, all of it. He sat at the table, opened the folder, and read every word. By the time he reached the end, tears were sliding silently down his cheeks. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, voice trembling. I believe that, I replied, but you still did. He nodded slowly. Then maybe the only way to make it right is to stop pretending I can fix it alone. For the first time, he didn't argue and justify. He just sat there. Broken open. Honest. Human. We started counseling after that, not marriage counseling, not yet family counseling. Because whether I liked it or not, Lila was family now. The first session was awkward. The therapist, a kind older woman named Ruth, asked us to describe what home meant to each of us. Lila said, somewhere you can tell the truth without getting punished. Marcus said, a place that forgives mistakes. When it was my turn, I hesitated, then said, a place where love doesn't need to hide. Ruth nodded as if we'd just drawn 3 corners of the same broken triangle. Weeks passed. We started having dinners together, slow, quiet, sometimes painfully awkward, but real. I learned that Lila liked strawberry jam but hated toast, that she played piano better than Marcus ever could, that she missed her mom in ways she couldn't put into words. And slowly, something unexpected began to bloom, not forgiveness yet, but understanding. Because for all the pain Marcus had caused, he had also built something fragile and precious in those moments, a chance to heal. One evening, after dinner, Lila handed me a drawing. It was of our house, but this time all 3 of us were standing in front of it. She'd written above it, home isn't who you live with, it's who you heal with. I had to excuse myself to cry in the kitchen. Later, I found that same phrase stuck on the fridge under a small magnet shaped like a heart. Marcus had placed it there quietly, without saying a word. But healing isn't linear. And peace never comes without one final storm. One Friday morning, just as things were beginning to feel steady, Ruth called me after a session Marcus attended, alone. Claire, she said gently, there's something you should know. My stomach dropped. What is it? She hesitated. Marcus has been receiving letters from Lila's mother, from before she passed. He hasn't shown them to either of you. I felt the world tilt again. Letters? I whispered. What do they say? Hestup for Frentunkersers. What do they say? I don't know, Ruth said softly. But he looked terrified. I ended the call, heart pounding, and sat in silence for a long time. Because in that moment, I knew the secrets weren't over, not yet. And when Marcus came home that evening carrying that same worn briefcase, I met him at the door and said, Yon Marcus, it's time you tell me everything. This time, no more hiding. He looked at me, eyes wide, and whispered, I was going to tomorrow because one of those letters wasn't from her, I frowned. Then from who? He swallowed hard. From someone who says they're our child. When Marcus said those words, someone who says they're our child, I felt the air leave my lungs. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Our child? I repeated slowly. Marcus, what are you talking about? He rubbed his temples the way he always did when he couldn't find the right words. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was some scam, someone trying to exploit what happened with Lila's mother. But then, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a faded envelope, the kind that had been opened and resealed too many times. The return address was smudged, but I recognized my own handwriting from nearly 20 years ago. The letter began simply, Dear Marcus, if you ever find this, please know I didn't do this to hurt you. I was young, scared, and I made choices I thought were right. But one day you'll have questions, and I hope this letter helps you find peace. I didn't remember writing it, but the signature was mine. And tucked behind it was another note. This one, written in a shaky teenage hand. I think you're my father. Mom's name was Angela. She said you knew her before you met Claire. I looked up at Marcus, my voice trembling. Who sent this? He swallowed. A girl named Maya. She's 16. Huh? Lives in Atlanta. She found the letter after her mother passed. The room spun. There were layers of betrayal here, not just between us, but around us. Secrets buried deep enough to suffocate a lifetime. I stood pacing the length of the room. Marcus, are you telling me there's another child out there, possibly yours, and you didn't say anything? You. Per continue to Pete B for his fish tatates you. He nodded silent. I didn't know how, he said softly. After everything with Lila, I thought this would destroy us completely. For the first time, I saw the weight he carried, not as an excuse, but as a burden he'd chosen to bear alone. And yet, his silence had consequences, because when the truth finally reached the surface, it didn't stay quiet. The following week, someone leaked the story, not to the press, to our family. It started with Marcus's sister, Ellen. She'd found out from a friend who worked at the school district, someone who'd seen the guardianship paperwork for Lila and mentioned another child in Georgia. By the time Sunday dinner rolled around, the whispers had spread faster than wildfire. I didn't even want to go, but Marcus insisted. We can't hide forever, he said. Funny, I replied, since that's all we've been doing. When we arrived, all eyes turned to us. Ellen stood near the kitchen island, arms crossed. Well, if it isn't the Johnson family secrets show. Yo, Ellen, please, Marcus started, but she cut him off. You lied to everyone, Marcus. To Claire, to your daughter. To us, I could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with judgment. Enough, I said quietly. This isn't helping. Ellen turned to me, eyes sharp. And you, how did you know? Yell. I met her gaze. Long enough to wish I didn't, the argument spiraled, voices overlapping, plates clinking, chairs scraping. Lila sat frozen in the corner, tears glistening in her eyes. Finally, I raised my voice. Stop! All of you. Room fell silent. I looked around at the faces that had once felt like home, now strangers drawn together by hurt. You want to judge him? Fine, but remember this, family isn't about who made the mistakes. It's about who chooses to stay after the truth comes out. Ellen's expression softened, just a little. Marcus looked at me like he'd never seen me before. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't speak for him. I spoke for myself. The fallout lasted weeks, calls, messages, questions I didn't have answers for. And somewhere in between, a letter arrived from Maya herself. I don't want money or drama. I just wanted to know if he's really my dad. I've been watching your interviews online, Miss S. Johnson, you seem kind. I just want to know if there's a place for me, too. And I sat on the couch, reading it over and over, my throat tightening with every line. Because in her words, I heard the echo of Leela's pain, of every child who just wanted to belong. I showed the letter to Marcus that evening. He read it quietly, then said, "What do you want to do?" And that question hung between us, heavy and impossible. Because part of me wanted to protect what little peace we built, and another part knew peace couldn't exist without truth. Finally, I said, "We meet her, together, no lies, no pretending." He nodded, tears welling again. "Are you sure?" "Oh, no," I whispered, "but it's time." When we met Maya 2 weeks later, she stood outside a small cafe, nervously holding her backpack straps. She looked so much like Marcus, same eyes, same quiet presence. When she smiled, though, I saw something else. Something gentle, something that made me realize this wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about legacy, about how truth can heal or destroy depending on how we hold it. "Hi," she said softly, "you must be Claire." I smiled back. "Yes." "And you must be the brave one who wrote to us." She laughed shyly. "I guess so." Marcus stepped forward then, voice shaking. "Maya, I'm sorry for everything." She looked up at him and said, "I just wanted to know who I came from. That's all." There was no dramatic embrace, no sudden forgiveness. Just 3 people sitting at a table, learning how to exist in the same truth. And for once, the silence between us didn't feel like hiding. It felt like healing. But as we drove home that night, a quiet unease lingered. Because somewhere deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something Marcus hadn't told me. Something buried even deeper than the letters, deeper than the lies. And when I glanced at him in the passenger seat, staring out the window, lost in thought, I saw the flicker of guilt still written across his face. "Marcus," I said softly, "what aren't you saying?" He didn't look at me. He just whispered, "Maya wasn't the only one who wrote." My heart sank when he said that Maya wasn't the only one who wrote. The words seemed to echo inside the car, over the hum of the engine, over the soft rattle of the loose air vent. I gripped the steering wheel, forcing my voice to stay calm. "What do you mean?" Marcus. Marcus exhaled. "There's another letter. From her mother. It came after she passed, but before Maya reached out." I turned to look at him, but his eyes were still fixed on the window, on the night sliding past us. "And you didn't think to tell me, He hesitated. It didn't feel like the right time. Everything was already falling apart. I wanted to yell, to cry, to ask how many not right times he'd already buried between us, but something stopped me. Exhaustion, maybe. Or the quiet realization that anger wouldn't change what had already been done. "Do you still have it?" I asked. "You?" He nodded. "It's in the desk drawer at home." That night, I sat at our kitchen table while Marcus handed me the letter, neatly folded, edges worn. I could see tear stains that had bled into the ink, the kind that come from years of regret. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, almost too careful. "Dear Marcus, if you're reading this, I know you found out about Maya. I want you to understand something. I never meant for her to grow up without you. I kept my silence because I didn't want to ruin what you had. Claire always seemed kind. She didn't deserve to carry a stranger's mistake, but one day, Maya will want to know her truth. Please let her. Don't hide her like a secret. Love her like a miracle you didn't see coming. Angela, I read it twice, then a third time. By the end, I realized something that took all the fight out of me. This woman hadn't been my enemy. She'd made choices out of fear, maybe even love. And somehow through all of this, the one thing that had truly been broken wasn't my marriage. It was trust. Over the next few weeks, I started to rebuild that, not for Marcus, not even for Maya, but for myself. Marcus began going to therapy, alone first, then with me. At first, I didn't speak much. I just listened. To the way he described the guilt, the shame, the years of pretending he'd handled it. I kept thinking if I ignored it long enough, he told the therapist one day, it would stop being real. And I remember saying quietly, secrets don't disappear when you hide them. They just wait to be discovered. That was the day something shifted. He looked at me, really looked, and I could tell he finally understood what his silence had cost me. Not just the truth, but my sense of safety in my own home. Maya visited more often after that. Sometimes alone, sometimes with her aunt. She was cautious, polite, always testing the space between us. One afternoon, she and Lila were sitting in the living room, laughing over an old photo album. They found a picture of Marcus from college, grinning awkwardly, shirt half untucked. "Wow, Dad, you really thought this haircut was okay?" Lila teased. Maya giggled, covering her mouth. "At least now, I know where I get my bad hair days." The word Dad hung in the air for a moment. Marcus froze, blinking back tears. But instead of correcting her, he simply smiled. And somehow in that laughter, that shared silliness, I saw something beginning to heal. Still, it wasn't simple. Healing never is. There were days when I'd catch myself watching Marcus too closely, wondering if there were more truths hiding behind his quiet eyes. Days when forgiveness felt like a mountain I didn't have the strength to climb. But there were also mornings, soft, ordinary ones, where we'd sit by the kitchen window, coffee in hand, and talk like old friends again. Not about what was lost, but about what we could still save. A few months later, Maya came to stay with us for a weekend. One evening while setting the table, she asked, "Do you hate me?" I looked up, startled. "Why would you think that?" Terye Fortation quote. She shrugged. "Because I remind you of what happened." I set down the dishes and walked over, resting my hands on her shoulders. "Sweetheart, you remind me of truth." "That's nothing to hate." Her eyes welled up. "I just didn't want to ruin your family." I smiled gently. "You didn't ruin it. You helped rebuild it." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with the lights low, the sound of the old clock ticking softly in the corner. I thought about all the women who'd come before me, mothers, wives, 6 twin daughters, each carrying their own quiet betrayals, their own private reconciliations. And I realized something simple yet profound. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to keep your heart open, even when it's been cracked. Marcus came in, sitting beside me on the couch. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Getting there." He reached for my hand, hesitant, "Thank you for not walking away." I looked at him, and for once, I didn't see the man who lied. I saw the man trying to make it right. "Don't thank me," I said softly. "Just don't waste it." He smiled faintly. I won't." In the end, we didn't become a perfect family, but we became a real one. One stitched together by truth, mended by time, and held, however imperfectly, by love. When I look back on everything, the secrets, the tears, the sleepless nights, I sometimes wonder how we made it through. But the truth is, life doesn't give you perfect endings. It gives you choices to break or to rebuild. I learned that love isn't about never being lied to. It's about what you do after the truth comes out. Do you harden your heart so nothing can hurt you again? Or do you let the cracks become windows where the light can shine through? There were nights I hated Marcus for what he'd done. Days I couldn't look at Maya without remembering the lie she was born into. But over time, I realized she wasn't the wound, she was the healing and forgiveness. It wasn't a gift I gave Marcus, it was the peace I gave myself. People often think betrayal destroys love, but sometimes it only strips it bare, forces you to see what's real underneath the illusion. And if you're lucky, what's left isn't bitterness, it's truth. If you've ever discovered a secret that broke your world open, I hope my story reminds you, pain doesn't mean the end of love. Sometimes it's just the beginning of understanding. Would you have forgiven him? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading every one. And if this story touched something in your heart, please subscribe for more true stories. Please subscribe for more true stories every day. Stories of love, loss, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going. Because maybe, just maybe, someone out there needs to hear that healing is still possible.